Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome, my dear faves. This is part 10 of What If Ichigo Lost His Zanpakuto in the World of One Piece. Credit goes to Unseated 4th. Chapter 29. Shriekers and Specters. The chilling windstorm lasted for the better part of an hour. Harsh gusts lashed at the bark on trees, snapped twigs and sent turrets of snow plummeting from branches to the ground below. A substance composed of snow and ash blew across the landscape in icy sheets, the wind rippling at the snow-covered ground. Nami and Sanji waited it out in a small alcove of rocks, where they were sheltered from the worst of the extreme weather. They had successfully escaped those creatures, whatever they were, for the time being. Nami grimaced at the thought of them. Perhaps they had the weather to thank for that. She'd noticed the oncoming storm in time for them to seek cover, and then the gale had hit. Sanji crouched beside her, both their backs pressed against the sturdy boulder, their position shielding them from the majority of the wind's wrath. When the wind calmed, the sky was still as dark as it always had been, and the full moon glowed through a thin layer of cloud. In the course of a few minutes, the wind died down until it was gone completely. An eerie calm crept over their part of the island once more, as though there'd been no change on the weather. Nami knew that now would be the best time to move. "Let's go," she muttered, getting to her feet and wrapping her coat slightly tighter around her shoulders against the winter's chill. "Of course, Nami-san," Sanji said as he stood beside her, the flickering of his eyes indicating that he was on the alert. They had to move. Now that the wind was calm, it was only a matter of time before they met those things again. Returning to the sunny would be their goal for now. Once they were there, Nami would allow herself to mourn the paradise they could have landed at instead. "It was this way," she said warily. "The coast was over here. We'll follow it until we get back to Sunny." "What about Marimo and Chopper?" Sanji asked. "They'll be fine," Nami assured. "By some miracle they might even have made it back to the Sunny ahead of us. If not, we'll just have to get the others to help us find them, I guess." The pair walked onwards together, in the direction they figured the coast to be. It was quiet now. Their footsteps crunching through the newly fallen ash snow probably carried for meters around them, and Nami tried to be as silent and nimble as possible. Beside her, Sanji was doing the same. Though, she figured, he was probably doing a better job at it. He was good at moving swiftly, and was light on his feet. She'd probably never say it out loud to him, however. Especially not now, as she imagined the enthusiasm of his response would probably be loud enough for every one of those creatures to pinpoint their location, and Nami certainly didn't want that. At irregular intervals along their silent journey, burning crevices dotted the ground, tunneling deep into the earth and reaching a fiery pit below. Briefly, Nami wondered if they'd arrived at the entrance to hell, but quickly swept the thought aside and continued through a light forest with Sanji. Eventually, the sounds of gentle waves reached their ears and they found themselves back by the seaside. "All right. It was this way," Nami said, recognizing a stone outcropping they'd passed with Zoro and Chopper earlier. Sanji responded by praising her expert skill with his usual adoring proclamations, and Nami brushed them off with a smile. Hopefully Zoro and Chopper had had the sense to come back this way as well, though Nami severely doubted it. For now, their swordsman and doctor would be easier to find if they got the others involved in the search. They soon reached the familiar natural harbor from earlier, though something was wrong. Something was missing. Something very obvious. Nami frowned out at the vacant harbor. It was here, she stated. The ship was here. Sanji gazed up and down the coast. Are you sure, Nami-san? He asked. The ship is supposed to be here, she insisted bluntly. There was no sign of it. Not a trace. The water it had so recently been resting in bobbed gently with its underwater currents, as though it had always been vacant. But Nami knew she was right. And she knew Sanji knew she was right as well. He was just in denial of a scenario in which the ship had vanished, leaving them stranded in such a place. She couldn't blame him either. There were numerous things that could have happened to the ship in a place like this. They could have sailed up or down the coast slightly, she supposed, squinting into the distant fog in either direction. But why would they have done that? Without waiting for us or telling us anything, no less. Something must have happened, Sanji said. They wouldn't leave without us. They have to be on the island somewhere, all of them. Nami frowned out into the thickening fog. Those things from earlier, she muttered, the sounds and snarls of said creatures still vivid in her mind. Do you think they could have attacked? Quote. I don't know, Nami-san. Nami gazed out into the night. In the distance, she could have sworn she saw something move. Instinctively, she moved closer to Sanji. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, the fog messing with her. But then it happened again. Nami-san, Sanji breathed sharply. She reached for the Climatact strapped to her jeans, ready to wield it should she need to. But there was nothing. If there was anything out there, it was biding its time. And Nami didn't like it. She was about to say something to Sanji, when amidst the silence a dull rumbling sounded. What's that? Nami wondered out loud. It came from beneath them, a low trembling that slowly grew in intensity and shook the surrounding landscape. Nearby, tree branches sifted piled up snow, and the surface of the water quavered threateningly. And if Nami listened hard enough, she could swear she heard a low, unearthly howl from somewhere beneath. But that part was only her imagination. It had to be. As quick as the rumbling came, it stopped. Nami quickly looked over to the trees where she and Sanji had seen something move. But it seemed as though whatever it was had been scared away. But for how long, Nami could only guess. We can't stay here, Sanji resolved. There has to be a reason the ship isn't here anymore. Let's find the others. Brook paced his way along the embankment, softly humming to himself to fill in the silence that otherwise surrounded him. It had all happened very quickly. The lot of them and Lion-san had been flung across the island and scattered. How far was he from anyone else, he wondered. But that didn't matter now. This place was quite spooky, and he felt the sooner they left, the better. Hopefully the others would be okay, but he figured that given what they'd been through in the past, a place like this wouldn't be much of a problem. It was especially useful that the full moon was out at a time like this though. His eyes wouldn't have to adjust much to the dim light at all. Not that he had eyes, of course. He chuckled softly to himself at his own joke as he gazed again out at the landscape that surrounded him. Such a cold landscape, the forest, the low fog, the snow and ice and the form of the large mountain that loomed over everything. Brook continued to hum to himself as he flicked his cane over his shoulder, dusting snow up with it. How long would it be until he found someone? It could be some time. He could make another snowman, he supposed. He'd already made 3, after all. Even as he continued, however, an unfamiliar chill lingered in the air. Brooke wasn't sure why. It wasn't as though this was the first time he'd been alone in the mist. The others were out on the island as well, and he wouldn't let any of them wander on their own. Not if he could help it. Chopper hurried alongside Zoro at a quickened pace, his short arms flailing madly. "How are we gonna find the others now?" Exclamation mark. He questioned furiously. Zoro shrugged. "We're bound to run into them at some point if we keep going like this. Besides, they might sail the ship to another part of the island and meet us there. But how would we know? We haven't even found the ocean again, Zoro." Zoro sighed. "When all else fails, just keep walking in a straight line. You'll end up going in circles." Quote. Zoro was about to compose a response, when noise from within the trees alerted him to another presence. "Something's there." Chopper panicked, suddenly clinging to Zoro's leg. Zoro's grip on the hilt of Shisui tightened, though he still didn't sense danger. The rustling of the trees came closer and closer, until a familiar form toppled out of the forest and appeared before them. Zoro blinked. "Usopp?" He questioned, "Weren't you with the others?" Quote. However, the sniper didn't seem prepared to answer his questions. "Zoro. Chopper," he cried, "boy am I glad to see you." Quote. "Usopp." Chopper tearfully responded, launching himself into the sniper's arms. "What are you doing out here?" Zoro asked, "Are you lost?" Quote. "Well, about that," Usopp began. "We're lost, Usopp." Chopper blurted, "Zoro got us lost. But you can show us the way back, right?" Quote. "Well," Usopp began, placing the reindeer back on the ground, "to tell you the truth, I am lost. Everyone is. Something happened back at the Sunny." Zoro frowned. "What?" Quote. "When Robin, Ichigo and I got back, we were below deck and we heard weird footsteps from above," he explained fervently. "When we went to investigate, there were some strange footsteps going across the deck. We then saw someone standing on the shore, but I couldn't quite see what they looked like, the mist was getting heavy. And then something happened beneath the water and the ship went flying. We were all separated." "I see, so that's how it happened," Zoro responded calmly with a nod as Chopper gawked. "Have you encountered anything else aside from that?" Quote. "Well, after I landed someplace up over there, not really," Usopp replied. "It's been cold, but that's about it." "Oh," Zoro said. "So he doesn't know. What happened to you guys, by the way?" Usopp asked. "I get that you managed to get lost, but how did you lose Nami and Sanji?" Quote. "It was really scary." Chopper sobbed dryly. "Huh? What happened?" Quote. "Usopp, did you get a good look at that person you said you saw on the shore before the Sunny was blasted away?" Zoro asked. No. But I think they made those footprints." "What were the footprints like?" Quote. Well, it was evident they'd been made by feet that had walked across the deck." "I know that, you dumbass." "What did they look like?" Quote. Usopp paused to think about the question and gulped. "They were pretty long. And it looked as though each toe has some sort of claw or talon at the end." Zoro recalled the creatures they'd encountered earlier. Whilst he hadn't been paying attention much to their feet at all, the description seemed to fit. "It's one of the monsters." Chopper quivered. "Monsters? What?" Exclamation mark. Quote. "There were monsters here as well." Chopper replied in panic, "And there was an explosion too." They caused us to become separated from Nami and Sanji. Oi, you two, Zoro cut in, causing the pair to slowly turn and face him. Keep it down. What's out there? Usopp asked, his mind likely filtering through every type of monster he could imagine. We should keep moving, Zoro said, we'll explain as we go. Ichigo opened his eyes. Against the continuous sound of the winter's gale above and the crackling flames below, he dozed off. It had been a light sleep however, and he'd woken due to the continuous sound being subdued somewhat. The hum of the wind had lessened. It couldn't have been too long that they'd come down here, he figured. A few hours at most. Beside him, Luffy was snoring loudly. A good sign, at least. This was all the more exemplified when the Straw Hat Captain groaned something about food in his sleep, though Ichigo realized they had none. But there was a lake nearby. There had to be some way they could catch a fish. He stood carefully, gently lowering Luffy's upper body to the ground. He'd been leaning against Ichigo after all, and ascended back up through the floor and into the remains of the small house. He stood in the cold and stretched, his joints still half asleep, before making his way down to the lake. The freshly fallen snow was light and powdery, though not pure white. There was a fair density of ash within it. Nonetheless, it didn't create much of a problem for Ichigo as he approached the lake. It was mostly frozen over, as he'd expected. If only he still had a sword on him, it would make this task easier. He resolved to improvise instead. However, he soon found that there was nothing appetizing about anything the lake had to offer. In fact, if Ichigo had to guess, the healthier option would be to not eat at all. They'd last for now. By the time he returned to the cellar, Luffy had awoken and was stretching, or at least trying to. At any rate, he seemed to be improving. Ichigo guessed that given another hour or so rest, he'd be bouncing off the walls. Even so, heading outside in his current condition wouldn't do much good for his health. But given their circumstance, it was necessary. Luffy leant back against the wall, returning to his dazed state. Food, he grunted. We might find some elsewhere, Ichigo said as he reclaimed his place beside him. Luffy muttered what may have been a response, but Ichigo couldn't quite decipher it. He then shivered slightly against the cold, despite the warmth of the earth underneath, and Ichigo soon found himself reaching across Luffy's back and rubbing to help keep him warm. A few moments went by with no interaction, and Ichigo had all but thought the Straw Hat Captain had fallen asleep again, when he spoke. We're almost there, he said. Huh? Ichigo responded, having been on the verge of dozing off himself. We're almost at the final glade, Luffy clarified, where your Zangetsu is. Wow, I guess we are, Ichigo realized. He'd almost become used to the fact Zangetsu was so far away. After that, I can worry about getting home, he supposed. I've been away for a while now, it's Urahara's fault I ended up here to begin with. He can probably bring me back somehow. Do you miss your friends? Luffy asked. Yeah, I do, Ichigo said. A lot has happened in the time I've been with you guys though. It feels like it's gone so fast, and yet it also seems like ages ago that I met you. I know what you mean, Luffy said with a laugh. I wonder if they know where I am by now, Ichigo said. I've been gone for long periods of time before, but it's always been different from this. I bet Yuzu and Karen miss you, Luffy said. How do you know about them? Ichigo asked, surprised. I heard you telling Nami about them back in Atlantica. Ichigo recalled the day of the whole drama on the high-tech, prehistoric island, mere hours before the incident started. He and Luffy hadn't been on good terms at that time. Luffy had been goofing off nearby whilst Ichigo had spoken to Nami of his family. "You were listening back then?" Quote, "You'd be a good big brother, Ichigo," Luffy said sleepily. "You would be as well," Ichigo responded. "You don't have brothers though, do you?" Luffy asked. Ichigo thought for a moment. "I have friends who are like brothers to me, if that counts. What about you? Do you have brothers?" Quote. The question slipped out before Ichigo could think it through. Immediately, he remembered what Nami had told him in Atlantica, about Luffy's older brother. Luffy muttered. Ichigo recalled one of the first nights he'd spent on the ship, when Luffy had questioned him about seeing the dead. Subconsciously, his grip on Luffy's arm tightened by a fraction. "But now I have my nakama," Luffy said with a smile, "and for now, that's all the family I need." They'd been walking for a while now. It felt like a while anyway. It was hard to tell how much time had passed when the sky consistently remained the same color. Sanji took a breath of the cigarette in his mouth, savoring the way the nicotine washed over his entire body. And he'd need to savor it. There was less than half a packet left in the pocket of his jacket and there was no way of knowing when they'd find the others or the Sunny. Where could they have gone anyway? Nami had suggested they continue along the coast and follow a river should they come to one. The Sunny could have been sailed inland. After what Sanji estimated to be about half an hour of walking, they'd reached a river wide enough for the Sunny to easily sail down and began their way along it. So far, there'd been no sign of any of their crew or ship. Sanji found it strange. It certainly wasn't like the others to go elsewhere in such a place without waiting for them, or letting them know. Unless, of course, something had happened. And Sanji was certain something had. Those monsters from earlier kept reappearing in his mind. Had they attacked the others as well? What if they hadn't been prepared? For one thing, there was Chopper and Marimo, who he certainly wasn't worried about, who'd encountered those creatures when he and Nami had. But then there was also Robin's group who'd gone to investigate the ruins. Had they been attacked? And what about those back at the ship? Luffy was barely in any condition to come and explore the island, let alone prepare himself for an attack from those things. Sanji knew, however, that when push came to shove, his captain would, somehow, be able to fight. But at the moment it would be best if he didn't have to. Beside him, Nami walked in equal silence. Sanji guessed the same things were probably going through her mind and sighed internally. If only they weren't in such a situation, this could be perfect. Just he and Nami-san alone together, like a date. Nami glanced over at him and their eyes met. "She's looking at me. You've got a stupid expression on your face again," she reported after a brief moment. "Nami-san, you're so beautiful when you're being blunt," he told her with a smile. Nami exhaled and looked away from him, instead concentrating on their path ahead. They continued as such for another few more minutes in silence, before the sound of light footsteps echoed from the nearby forest edge. "Sanji-kun," Nami breathed, glancing out into the trees. Something was there, moving in the darkness. "Please be someone from the crew," Sanji silently chanted in his mind, though the closer the presences came, the clearer it wasn't. Please be someone from the crew. It wasn't. As quick as they'd come last time, a dozen of them leapt out from the trees, their hair-raising cries ringing loudly in the night. This was what had attacked them earlier, though whether or not it was the exact same pack, Sanji wasn't certain. He suspected it wasn't, however. But unlike last time, they were at a better advantage. He was prepared, and so was Nami. Making quick use of Diabol Hambi, he managed to incapacitate the first two straight away. It was then, illuminated in full by the moonlight, that Sanji saw them in their entirety. Grotesque and so human-like, their skin was pale gray and their semi-clothed bodies twisted and deformed. But it was their eyes that haunted him. Sanji had looked into the eyes of few dead men in his time, but it was all the same. Those lifeless eyes that seemed to stare at all yet none, some with pupils diluted to appear as nothing as dark voids, others with nothing but whites. He kicked at a nearby one, releasing stream of fire from his red-hot foot. The creature shrieked, a foul and unearthly noise that caused the hairs on the back of Sanji's neck to stand on end. Gritting his teeth and biting down hard on his cigarette, he swerved in the air, kicking his leg out and sending the creature flying into the trunk of a tree. Likewise, Nami was fending them off with her climb attack. "Nami-san, stay close," Sanji instructed as a few more burst forth from the forest, though he was sure there was no need to tell her. However, as more creatures surrounded them, something strange occurred. At first, Sanji only glimpsed it from the corner of his vision. When he took down the creature he'd been currently fighting, he quickly glanced over. But it was gone. He returned his full attention to the task at hand. Gust sword. Nami shouted, sending two of the shriekers toppling into one another in a whirlwind. As Sanji took down another, he noticed what seemed to be another presence, different to those that he and Nami were currently fighting. A flicker at the edge of his vision and it was gone again. But it had definitely been there. Something else was there, aside from the shrieking creatures. And they seemed to be noticing it too, for slowly but surely, the creatures were hurrying back into the woods. Why are some of them retreating? Nami breathed. Sanji didn't want it to be what he thought it was, yet the longer they waited, the clearer it became. The creatures weren't retreating because they were being defeated. They were retreating because they were intimidated, though not by he or Nami. It then appeared in clear vision, amongst the remaining collection of shriekers. A long, dangling body that towered over the other creatures. Upon noting its presence, they howled cries of what might have been fear, before scrambling for coverage. They didn't even seem interested in their recent prey anymore. And no wonder. A dark tendril shot forth, which may have been the new entity's arm, wrapping itself around the body of a nearby shrieker. With painstaking pace, the tendril tightened. Sanji and Nami looked on in horror as the creature was gradually sliced to pieces, the other creature then beginning to feed on it. The few shriekers remaining in the clearing seemed to forget their recent fear. The other thing was distracted at the moment. It was only a matter of time before they returned their attention to the two pirates they'd been attacking, or worse, the new creature gained interest. Seizing his opportunity, Sanji took Nami by the wrist, and together they ran. The mist was thickening again. Zoro crossed the snowy landscape at a swift pace, the other two at his side, Usopp occasionally prodding them in another direction to avoid going in a circle. If what the sniper had said was accurate, then there was no point going back to the coast they'd left the Sunny anyway. No one would be there. The best they could do now was to wander the island and search for any sign for the others or Sunny. At the very least, they were somewhere on the island. They would have to meet eventually. More pressing matters, however, involved just what else they might meet before then. He, Chopper, Nami and Sanji had experienced those shrieking creatures firsthand, and from what Usopp had described, he and the others on the Sunny had seen one on the shore before being separated. Just what were those things anyway? Furthermore, were the others on their own in this damned place? The least he knew was that Sanji was with Nami, and as much as he thought the cook was an idiot, he knew that he'd go to any length to protect their navigator from immediate harm. And as for the others, from what Usopp had described, Brook was likely on his own. He wasn't sure about Frankie or Robin, and Luffy. Zoro's thoughts switched to his captain, who was still worse for wear. Only yesterday he'd still been bedridden, and now he was out in this. Zoro didn't doubt his captain could overcome the challenges of this island given his current condition, but even so, it was bad timing. His stretching abilities were temporarily nullified, after all. Not to mention he was still, as a whole, a lot weaker than he'd normally be. But Zoro wouldn't allow himself to worry about such a thing. This was Luffy. That idiot always bounced back, after all. Besides, Ichigo was with him. Albeit likely unarmed, at least Luffy wasn't on his own in his current condition. So for now, Zoro could focus on other things. Like trying not to go in circles, and keeping an eye on the other two. Chopper had turned to Walk Point for easier travel through the snow. He was in his natural environment after all. It made sense he'd prefer to revert to his original form. He even pushed the snow about with his antlers, occasionally flicking some of it at Usopp for the fun of it. He was enjoying himself. Or maybe he was just trying to distract himself from the creepy air the island seemed to radiate. Yes, that had to be it. This was Chopper's way of coping, as consistent chattering against the cold and claiming not to be scared every few minutes was Usopp's. Zoro was fairly unfazed. Each to their own. Those creatures, however, Zoro's thoughts wandered back to them as he gripped the hilt of one of his katanas. He narrowed his good eye and glanced through the trees, trying to detect any movement. Not that he could sense any right now, but something was telling him to be wary. Usopp had noticed his actions. "What is it?" Exclamation mark. The sniper asked, attempting, and failing, to hide his anxiety. Zoro didn't reply, but reached out with his sensory haki. "Nothing?" Usopp questioned further, before breaking into a forced laugh. "Oh, very funny, Zoro-kun. I see how it is. I know this place is a bit creepy, so you're probably—" "Shut up," Zoro interrupted him. Usopp ceased talking instantly and Chopper came to their side, also stopping whatever it was he'd been doing. Zoro prepared to slide his katanas out of their sheaths should any movement occur in the darkness ahead of them. Something was there, his haki was telling him that much, but was it one of those shrieking creatures? The presence he felt was unlike any other he'd experienced. It was different again to those humanoids from before. It was a very thin, wispy presence, yet still promised the full potential of any strong opponent he'd faced. If it were a color, it would be a gray color and nearly transparent. Almost like a ghost. Chopper suddenly cried out, his entire reindeer body trembling like some sort of jello. And there it was, standing beside a tree little over 4 meters away. A faceless being, clothed in rags that almost blended with the color of the night sky. It seemed to be drifting, the rags that encased its body lightly brushing the snow beneath it, with no evidence of feet. But it was nothing like the dopey-looking things Perona had tormented him with during those 2 years. Was this even actually a ghost? Another one. Usopp stammered from beside him, Black Kabuto raised in a trembling hand. Sure enough, another similar entity had materialized near the other. Zoro recalled the monsters from earlier and compared them to the apparitions before them right now. These were different from the shrieking entities from earlier. These ones were taller, thinner, and unnervingly silent. They sent a creeping chill factor even Zoro couldn't deny. He could only imagine how the other two were holding up. There was movement towards the far side of his vision, as the later arrivals slowly and soundlessly drifted toward them. The ghost. It's coming. Chopper panicked once more. Zoro would have taken the time to correct the little reindeer and assure him that the entities before them right now weren't ghosts. Except he wasn't sure himself. The figure gliding towards them came to a stop. It then seemed to flicker. Zoro tilted his head at the strange phenomena a few meters away as if flickered in and out of visibility a few times. And then it was right beside him. What? Exclamation mark. Was the only thought he had time to process, before one of the long limbs came flying towards him in a slashing motion. But Zoro was faster. He parried the phantom attack with a swing of his katana, the metal meeting the ghost-like tendril with an off-twanging sound. The creature reeled back a little, moving to strike again. The second one appeared beside them also, but Zoro was preoccupied with the initial attacker. Fire Bird Star. Usopp shouted, shooting a projectile at the entity. However, the specter-like creature had already flickered away before the Firebird could reach its target. Nonetheless, the attack was effective. The explosion of bright light temporarily lit up the surrounding landscape. The two specters, which up until now had been deathly silent, let loose a pair of awful high-pitched screeches, before vanishing from sight. And then there was silence again, save from the ringing caused by the two departed entities. Was that my doing? Usopp questioned dumbfounded, Black Kabuto still raised from his recent attack. I don't think they liked the fire, Zoro responded, so yes, I guess so. Usopp immediately raised his weapon and laughed victoriously, before speaking in a voice that had always made Zoro think of Sogekane. Haha. Of course. Just as planned. Did I ever tell you about the time when I was 5 and took down an entire army of those things in one go? Quote. That's so cool, Usopp. Chopper squealed. Usopp began spinning one of his ridiculous stories whilst Chopper listened on in gullible amazement and Zoro simply rolled his eye. But we don't know how long that's going to keep them away for, he stated. They could show up again at any time, and your fire mightn't be as effective. Usopp and Chopper ceased their victorious chanting and looked over to the swordsman with stricken expressions. Come on, he ushered them gruffly, the sooner we move, the sooner we can find the others and get out of this damned hellhole. Chapter 30. Without resolution. The windstorm had long since tunneled through the cold remains of the once proud standing village, leaving everything as chilled and empty as it had been for quite some time. Robin warily stepped through the unmarked snow atop the narrow road of what was once a side street, and pondered the storm whilst the moonlight sprawled itself across the forgotten buildings and structures. Something had been out in that storm, but whatever it was gone now. There weren't even any traces of footprints left, due to already being buried by the snow blown in by the wind. It didn't take much thinking to guess what they had been, however. The journal in her coat had been clear enough on such matters. Beside her, Frankie was keeping an equally wary eye out for evidence of what may have passed within the storm, and if any of it remained. Occasionally, he'd check inside buildings, probably admiring the original interior he could picture. The more they explored the town, the more Robin recognized from the journal. Eventually, they reached a building that appeared to be slightly different from the others. Its towering exterior was at least twice the height of the surrounding buildings, and it was encased with a solid lacquer that shone in the moonlight. The building had suffered relatively little damage, probably due to the fact it had been built far more sturdily than the other structures about the small city. Was this the research facility that had been described in the journal? Robin glanced up and down the street, scanning for any building that may tell her otherwise. But this was it. This place could give us information, she stated. Frankie ran a large hand over the side of the structure, marveling the lacquer job that remained mostly in place, even after such a long time. Then let's take a look inside. They entered the building, their footsteps echoing gently throughout the vast interior. It was relatively spacious, with a few rooms shooting off into different directions. But this circular-shaped room they'd entered currently seemed like some sort of library. Robin was reminded vaguely of the interior of the Tree of Knowledge in Ohara, but pushed the memory aside. This place was a lot different. Against the furthest wall was a stone fireplace, which would have been welcoming had it been in use. But for now, it was old and dusty, likely untouched for a whole century. The room was very dim, the only light being a small section of moonlight streaming in from one of the windows. "It's too dark to see anything properly," Frankie remarked, "nipple lights." Quote, "With a flash, the entire room was lit up by the two powerful beam-like lights." Robin eyed the gimmick questioningly, before looking away in mild amusement. For the next few minutes, they occupied themselves by exploring the circular room. There were countless old books and scrolls on different scientific procedurals, though Robin guessed most of them were unrelated to the island's current predicament. Sure enough, many of the books were simply scientific journals on native flora and fauna. "Oi, Robin," Frankie's voice came from nearby, "this looks a bit like what you were reading before." The book in his hands appeared to be torn in a similar manner as the one she'd found at the ruined outpost. Robin reached into her coat and withdrew it. Frankie held out the recently recovered artifact whilst Robin placed the journal half from earlier atop it, both halves meeting perfectly at the binder. "It's the second half," she observed. It made sense it would be here. This research facility had been mentioned several times after all. It was little wonder the journal's author had spent a lot of time here. Frankie handed her the complete journal, and she carefully opened up the newly found half, sure enough finding the same scrawled handwriting as the first part held, and this time with later dates. "Do you want to read it?" he asked her. "Of course," she answered, "it won't take long, and it could give us vital information about those creatures and what to do should we encounter them in masses. Then we can search for Sunny and the others." Zoro stealthily traversed the icy wilderness, closely behind the tracks of the other two, his single eye peering out into their dark surroundings whilst his other senses listened and waited. Usopp was leading the way, much to his and Chopper's insistence. Not that Zoro figured it mattered much, they were lost either way. Nonetheless, his relinquishing of the lead seemed to put the other two much more at ease, and made for a lot less annoying background noise from the two. Right now, the topic of their conversation was just one of the ordinary. "Did I ever tell you about the time I conquered an entire city and defeated the gigantic gremlins keeping it captive?" The sniper questioned in a gloating tone. "Really?" Exclamation mark. Chopper shot back, excitement enticing his voice, "Tell me." Quote. Usopp proceeded to descend into a long-winded tale that left Zoro shaking his head and rolling his eyes. "That's amazing, Usopp." Chopper responded once he was finished, his eyes glowing with the intensity of 1,000 suns, and partially lighting the way for them along the dark path. Otherwise it was dark. They were walking through dense forest in which the trees blocked out much of the moonlight. Zoro opted to close his eyes and depend on his other senses for a moment. Sometimes sight could blind one to what was really going on, after all. From the edge of his consciousness, he noticed a flicker. What was that? He strained his sense of observation, casting it out into the surrounding darkness. There was definitely something there. Or rather, a lot of somethings there. But they were fairly far off and likely hadn't noticed them. Guys, keep it down. We're not alone, he told the other two, indicating the direction with a flick of his head. Chopper and Usopp followed his line of sight. What are you talking about, Zoro-kun? Usopp laughed feebly. There are a bunch of those creatures nearby, Zoro observed. They're hard to detect, but there are at least 10. Maybe more. In the moonlight, Usopp turned a weird pale color and looked out into the direction Zoro was facing. A dense concentration of the light simmered some way off in the distance. It seemed different to the fire pits that dotted the otherwise frozen landscape, more deliberate. Shapes flickered in the distant glimmering light. Breathless whispers and rasps could be heard if one were to listen closely, and Zoro knew better than to simply blame it on something in the wind, though that was probably what was carrying those noises over to them. Silently, he and the other two edged slightly closer, seeking cover in the form of the surrounding forest shrubs. It looks like a camp of some sort, Zoro observed. Usopp slid his goggles down over his eyes, squinting through them in the sparse light. It is a camp of some sort, he confirmed, but I can't tell what's going on there. Chopper sniffed at the air carefully and gagged. It smells terrible. He stated, repulsed. It looks like there's a whole lot of those creatures, Usopp observed, straining his eyes against the distant, limited light. They're gathered, I'm not sure what they're doing, and I'm not sure I want to know. I don't suppose it would be a good idea to ask them for directions, hey, Zoro half-joked. Do you want to get us killed? Exclamation mark. Usopp retaliated. I was joking. Now is not the time to joke. Chopper chastised him whilst Usopp attempted to keep his distance. Usopp, get out from behind me, Zoro requested. If we don't attract attention to ourselves, it shouldn't be a problem. So let's avoid contact with that camp. Agreed, Usopp and Chopper both echoed. Now, Zoro said, peering through the moonlight and occasional fire pits, to the looming form of Dussumet. Where do you think the others could be? Quote. Anywhere, replied Usopp, we were scattered across the island, after all. Zoro frowned. Things sure had become complicated. Let's move away from this area for now, he prompted. The other two didn't argue. They wandered in the same direction they'd been going for a few minutes, remaining extra alert to the sounds around them, and keeping the nearby camp in check. Soon, they reached another clearing. An abandoned-looking cabin sat a short way away at the clearing's edge. Zoro concentrated hard, but sensed no extra movements in or around it. He beckoned the others toward it. We'll stop in there for a bit, he announced to the other two. It will be easier to talk without being detected. They reached the house, carefully pushing open the long unused door. With a stiff creaking sound, the hinges broke off entirely, and the timber door would have come crashing to the ground with a tremendous thud had Zoro not caught it as it fell. Carefully, he and Usopp lowered it on its side against the adjacent wall, before taking a quick look around the room. Someone had once lived here. That much was evident, at least, based on the old wooden bed frame and closet in the corner. A dusty axe sat propped beside a small table. This house had probably belonged to a woodcutter back in the day, but they were long gone now. Presently, Usopp was taking the situation rather calmly. "We need to be quiet and not panic," he said intently. "That's the best way of deciding what we should do next." "Well, from what you said, everyone's got to be out there somewhere," Zoro said, "though even if we were to trace our steps back to where we left the Sunny, it wouldn't be there anymore, right?" Quote. Usopp shook his head. Even Sunny was blasted out of the water. "She'll be fine though, she probably landed on the mountain somewhere. It's the others I'm worried about though." Chopper shuddered. "Do you think they've met any of the monsters as well?" Quote. "Probably," Zoro answered. "That's not to say no one can take care of themselves, but the sooner we rejoin, the better it will be for everyone." Chopper and Usopp muttered their agreement. "The sooner we can find everyone, the sooner we can escape from this place," Usopp said. "So finding the others needs to be our top priority." "Yosh. We can do this." He looked out the small window into the night and frowned, noting the way it had fogged up. "Too bad this window is all misted up," he murmured, rubbing his hand in a circle motion over the vaporous surface of the glass. "It's too ominous when you can't see what's out there, ha ha ha." The residue was wiped away, leaving the window clean of any condensation. Outside, a thick mist had drifted up from the valley. "The mist got up here already?" Usopp questioned, blinking out at the airy environment. "That was fast." Chopper acknowledged, "It wasn't even foggy out there just a moment ago." Quote. "Not only was there mist, but it was really thick." Usopp stood at the window and squinted, barely able to see a meter outside. He strained his eyes all the more, trying to make out anything in the now dense fog. The faintest outline in the distance was probably the outline of a tree, barely 4 meters away. Yet now it was rendered almost invisible. A more definite shape then placed itself between the window and the tree, slightly more visible under the cover of the mist, and Usopp inched closer to the window to try and work out what it was. Until the near mist wafted aside to reveal the bare, glaring face of a shrieker, its bloodthirsty eyes bearing right into them, and its barred fangs contorted in a twisted snarl. Usopp let out a shriek of horror, latching himself to the closest person, who happened to be Zoro. "Ghost!" Chopper wailed, having attached himself to Usopp's leg. Zoro glared away his initial surprise, hand over the hilt of Sandai Kitetsu. "How did they know we were here?" He grunted. More importantly, how had he not sensed them approaching? The creature on the other side of the glass growled in a low undertone, which caused the window to tremble. "Damn it!" Usopp retorted, releasing his hold on Zoro and wielding the black kabuto. "If you're gonna stand here gawking at us, then at least come and put up a fight." Quote. "That's right." Chopper echoed, turning to his heavy point in a fit of courage. "Come and fight us, if you have the guts." Quote. Zoro wasn't entirely sure if the creature did have physical guts, but that didn't matter. Slowly, the entity raised a clammy hand, pushing it up against the narrow window. It then pounced, diving through the glass and somehow managing not to become stuck. It was fast, lunging itself at its targets. But Zoro was still faster. Within an instant, he had the other two behind him, and all 3 swords equipped. He ran at the shrieker as it launched itself towards him, catching it by sudden surprise and incapacitating it. He straightened up and glanced back at his nakama. That was close, Usopp sighed. Zoro didn't sheath his katanas. He stood and quietly listened. Get outside and prepare yourselves, he instructed them. Chopper grew to his heavy point and Usopp brandished the kabuto and stepped outside, as a set of shriekers burst forth from the mist-smothered forest. Of course there had been more than one of them out there to start with. Zoro was right behind the other two, leaping in and taking down two shriekers at once. Usopp fired a set of projectiles, catching another in the chest, whilst Chopper's fist slammed into the gut of another, sending it flying backwards. A moment later, the three stood in the midst of about a dozen defeated shriekers. Damn right. Usopp chanted, thumping the air victoriously. How do you like us now, hey? Quote. Zoro strained his senses, but was pretty sure he couldn't sense any more. Although he'd been sure of that before and been wrong. It won't be long before more get here, he stated, let's keep moving. Stay close. Nowhere is safe, Usopp lamented, his celebration over. What can we do if we can't avoid them? Exclamation mark. Chopper panicked. Isn't it obvious? Zoro questioned as he took a moment to secure his dark bandana over his head, kept his swords at the ready. Those ones we saw just now were the weaklings. Any we meet in the future will be stronger, but that won't change anything. We'll fight them. The air was crisp as it was earlier, yet didn't wield the same chilling bite as it had. Even so, Ichigo was wary of their surroundings as they ascended into the cold terrain, though nothing has changed from when he'd come up here last. Luffy had improved with the conditions. He was even enjoying himself. He made some sort of snow sculpture Ichigo had guessed to be a wonky slab of meat, only to be corrected that it was, in fact, a snow dragon. Such skill reminded Ichigo of none other than the captain of the 6th Division, though that was probably where Luffy and Byakuya's similarities ended. Oi Ichigo. Look at me. I'm a robot. Luffy enthusiastically stated, having put together an unsatisfactory excuse for snow armor. You're gonna get cold, Ichigo warned him. At least he was well enough to be making light of the situation. He did not notice the hurtling snowball until it was quite literally upon him. Got ya! Luffy cheered victoriously, bursting out of his snow armor. Ichigo smirked. So this was a game now, was it? Well, two could play at that. He reached down to the fresh, powdery snow, scooping up a handful and rolling it into a sphere. He aimed, though deliberately nowhere that would affect Luffy's injured shoulder, and instead catching him on the side of the hip. Luffy laughed and the two of them raced each other across the snowy landscape. Robin flicked to the 4th entry of the journal's second half. It seemed that the journal's author had composed himself somewhat and was not as frantic as in the closing entries of the first part. Though Robin knew the reason was more likely due to the fact the author had simply adjusted to the situation around him, rather than such situation improving. After all, she just had to look outside to see proof the island's situation hadn't improved at all in the long run. Among other things found in the lab was an eternal pose to a location labeled, Adlivin. From what Robin had read, that was the title of the solitary final glade, was said to be difficult to locate. The pose was a great asset, at least. Now, once Sunny and the crew were rounded up, they would be good to go. But perhaps that would be the tricky part. The light in the room was still dim, but not so much as before. Frankie had gotten a small fire going in the old fireplace, and was now exploring other parts of the town for any information that may help them and their nakama. He came back in every so often to report his findings, and ask her about her own. Then he'd be out again, searching the town for anything of use. Robin stayed where she was and continued to read. A surprising amount of the journal remained. She had assumed the journal's author had met his fate soon after the first part had been completed, but judging by what remained, the writer had stuck around for at least a few more months, and it was already proving rather helpful. One of the pages was a scribbled map of the island. It was a little difficult to decipher, but Robin was easily able to locate their current position. The town they were currently in was the largest of the few, with other small settlements scattered across the mountain. Perhaps if she read further, they would be mentioned. At this stage in time, there was at least a 3-day gap between each journal entry, however, so it was likely certain details of the author's endeavors would be left out. Furthermore, a new development was emerging in the most recent entry, one which only raised further questions. A lone figure wanders the mist, unaffected by our afflictions. He is not one of our own, though his image is far more of our likeness than that of the monsters around us. The passage intrigued Robin, and she quickly read on. The Gate Master, people call him. One who had existed since before time began on this island, and yet remained hidden until only recently. We believe him to be some form of temperamental spirit. No one dares approach him, for if he is who we think he is, legends say he alone has the power to bring unprecedented peril to those he wishes. A sudden disturbance interrupted Robin from the passage, and she looked up in time to see Frankie slide into the room. "You'll need to get back to your reading later, Robin," he announced. "They're coming. We super need to get out of here." Understood. Wasting no time, Robin closed the journal and tucked it away into her coat pocket as she followed Frankie out the door. Sanji savored his current cigarette as best he could. He had barely half a pack left, and there was no way of knowing when they'd find the ship, where he could replenish his supply. The warm breath of nicotine harshly contrasted the cold conditions, and in part distracted him from their recent encounter. Beside him, Nami seemed to be holding up well enough. She had insisted she was warm enough and didn't need his coat atop her own. Every so often, they would pass a fiery pit, where they would stand for a few moments to soak in the warmth before continuing their ascent up the massive form of Duscement. All the same, with altitude gained, the temperature would drop all the more. "It will be colder up the mountain, Nami-san," he cautioned. "I know that," she responded. "We don't need to climb all the way to the top, but if we get to higher ground, we'll be able to use the altitude to our advantage. Any sign of Sunny, any sign of the crew, anything would be helpful." She quickened her pace slightly, probably in effort to gain height sooner and get her blood pumping faster. Perhaps also in attempt to avoid any of those creatures that may have been lurking nearby. Sanji kept an even pace not far behind her, using his observation haki to detect whether or not there were other presences nearby. There weren't. However, something else caught his attention. "What's that over there?" He pondered, indicating to a landmark a small way ahead of them. Nami glanced ahead at it, squinting and shielding her eyes against the light snowfall. "I can't tell," she answered, "but it doesn't seem to be anything alive, does it?" Quote. Sanji shook his head and the pair of them steadily approached the mysterious landmark. Upon reaching close proximity to the structure, it proved to be a large cropping of stone. "There's some sort of carving," Nami observed. Sure enough, an array of markings adorned the surface of the stone, carvings that depicted some sort of story. Sanji took a closer look. Archaeology was neither his nor Nami's forte by any means. Robin was the expert on this sort of thing, but she wasn't here. However, the stones seemed to hold a lot more pictorial information than written, so with careful guessing, Sanji gathered he and Nami would be able to extract information on their own. As it was, Nami was already trying to transcribe information in the first carving. Sanji watched her fingers glide gently along the cold stone, before examining what he could on his own. This was made a long time ago, Sanji, he concluded after a moment. And the story it's telling is probably from an even longer time ago, Nami supposed. The first carving depicted what appeared to be a dark, celestial-like world, with an ocean lying beneath it. 5 stars bore down from the celestial scape and into the ocean below, one inside the other. A long time ago, a war raged high in the darkness of space. Nami began interpreting the images. In the chaos and destruction of the war, 5 stars fell to the world below. So this is their story of the glades, Sanji remarked. The 5 glades, Nami muttered, slowly moving along the carving, alongside Sanji. The next carving depicted one ring of the Isles in particular. I guess that's meant to represent this glade, Sanji said, the Forgotten. They slowly moved along the stone cropping, reading whatever pictures they could interpret. The next image was puzzling, depicting the form of a man being cast down to the island some time after the initial casting of curses. One man was banished here in a time before this place was settled, Nami deciphered, sliding some snow off the carved area to make it more readable, but it looks like he disappeared shortly afterwards, or something like that. That probably isn't the right interpretation for that bit, but hopefully the rest is a little more straightforward. Gradually, they noticed a pattern. The carvings depicted the glades of the calm, plague and sacrifice, all gradually becoming populated with human life over the years. The Forgotten, however, remained untouched. Every so often, it seemed humans would venture there. But they didn't stay long at all. Whether it was because they simply left the island, or perhaps never left at all, Sanji could only guess. They reached the last few images, mainly displaying the island becoming inhabited by humans once again, but thriving this time. Eventually people reached this place and were able to stay for some time though, Nami noted, before glancing back down the mountain the way they'd come. We can see that by the ruins all around the place. They obviously lived here long enough to settle somewhat. She looked back to the stone carvings, but what happened after that? Quote, there was one last image in the chronology of carvings. It depicted the island again, but this time without occupants, and completely cut off from any signs of life. Where's the resolution? Sanji pondered. All the others had one at the end of their stories, even if they proved false in the end. Who carved this anyway? Maybe the last part of the stone got lost. He began searching the area to see if any of the part of the stone had broken off, but found nothing. Nami remained staring at the carvings, something pressing on her mind. Sanji-kun, she began. He glanced over from his fruitless search. Yes, Nami Swan tilde? What if there is no resolution? Quote. Sanji looked at her stricken for a moment. What do you mean? Quote. What do you think I mean? Exclamation mark. If anything, the state of this island has only gotten worse since these stones were inscribed. What if this place remained, the Forgotten, rather than overcoming whatever it was cursed with? Quote. Sanji ceased his search and returned to Nami's side. He took a deep inhale from his cigarette. Do you think that's a possibility? Quote. Of course it is. Think about it. We have no idea what's going on here, what those monsters are or how they got here. We have no idea where the rest of the crew are, or if they have any more clue as to what's going on than we do. All we know is that this place was probably a lot nicer in the past, but receded back into the days it was cursed. Unless, what if the effects of this forgotten curse didn't set in right away? Quote. Huh? Quote. Meaning that instead of overcoming its curse, it slowly declined into it. This place was never originally the forgotten, it became the forgotten at some point along the line, after human occupation. Had the topic not been so grave, Sanji may have began showering Nami in loving praises and compliments right then and there. But something more simple would have to suffice for now. "You're as intuitive as you are beautiful, Nami-san," he said, crushing the stub of his used cigarette into the snow, "though we'd better keep climbing. We might spot the others soon, and we can let them know about this." Nami nodded, and together they left the stone carvings behind and continued ascending the form of Dussumet. The freshly fallen snow was freezing over and hardening up, becoming icy. If the sun were to show itself, they'd probably be nearing late afternoon. The island's night was approaching, and with it the increasing ominous sensation Luffy was experiencing, and he was sure Ichigo was feeling it too. He didn't see why night on this island should be any different to the day. He and Ichigo had ceased their game over an hour ago in favor of conserving their energy and searching for the others, though so far they'd had no luck. With nothing much to talk about, the two had continued on in silence for some time. Until now. "Oi, Luffy," Ichigo trailed behind him. Luffy responded. "Do you feel as though there's someone close by?" Quote. Luffy frowned, his observational haki tingling. It was strange. He'd first noticed it a while ago, but said nothing of it to Ichigo. But now that Ichigo had brought it up himself, he couldn't help but think about it. "I'm not sure," he said, coming to a stop. Ichigo stopped beside him. "It's weird," he said, peering into the surrounding trees and staring at a nearby fire pit. "It almost feels as though someone's there. But I can't sense them properly, like someone's masking their presence or something." Luffy agreed, a similar feeling at the pit of his stomach. Or maybe that was just the desire for food talking. Before anything else could be said, the outline of a person loomed in the night, rather unannounced. Luffy was quick to dismiss it as any of his crew members. It certainly wasn't anyone he knew. "Who's that?" he questioned out loud. Ichigo seemed equally confused, though this was obviously the presence they'd been vaguely detecting. The figure didn't speak. It slowly wandered from the direction they were traveling, strangely leaving no marks in the snow it stepped over. From what Luffy could see, the person was swathed in black. "Is this a friend of yours, Ichigo?" he asked out of genuine curiosity. The presence before them had an otherworldly feel about it, after all. Why would he be? Exclamation mark. The Shinigami shot back at him. "Those robes are a little like the ones you wore when I met you." "They're a little different to the Shinigami uniform, actually," Ichigo corrected, "but now isn't the time for that." "Who is he?" Quote. "I suppose we could ask," Luffy thought. "Who are you?" He asked the entity. He received no answer. "That didn't work," he said to Ichigo. "Have you seen our friends?" Ichigo attempted. Still, no answer came from the mysterious being. Ichigo glanced across to Luffy. "How about you try something again?" Quote. Luffy frowned. "Well, what should I say to him?" He looks like a sad taco. You really are hungry, aren't you? Quote. Oi. Sad taco. Do you know how we can find our friends? Or are you lost as well? Quote. Luffy, I don't think any of those approaches will work. You don't know if you don't try. In the time they'd been arguing, the figure had drawn to a stop and was now bearing over them in silent observation. Luffy and Ichigo ceased their exchange when they realized the mysterious figure was basically upon them. You are walking a dangerous path, it warned in a deep, rasping voice. Luffy tilted his head slightly. Wasn't that obvious? This island was a dangerous place. He could tell by just standing out here with his eyes closed. He glanced across to Ichigo, who was sporting a similar expression. There was something strange about this being. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't like anything else he'd ever encountered before either. This figure before them was powerful. Luffy could almost feel shockwaves of destructive potential oozing out of the man's presence. But it was secured, as though if it were to spill forth, the fabric holding together the world itself would be torn apart. Ichigo, Luffy muttered. Though he probably didn't need to. The Shinigami seemed equally keen at discerning his opponent's capabilities. The stranger raised a hand, and the pair watched carefully. With a sudden movement, the hand was brought down. Luffy's breath hitched as the cold air thickened around them. But there was nothing more, the stranger was gone. Ah, he went, Luffy observed, frowning as he adjusted his hat and stifled a cough against the chilly air. Ichigo gave a confused glance up at the sky. But where did he go? Quote. Luffy shrugged. Maybe he got hungry. Seeming without explanation, the wind began to pick up in speed, dragging a dense fog over the area. Oi Luffy, Ichigo said, stick close, it's easy to get lost in this weather. Let's wait it out by that boulder or something. Yosh. From the sky's night-like void, a cold, strong wind burst free, escaping as though it had been a captive prisoner, finally given the chance to be flee. With it came like a tsunami of fog, swamping the pair and everything around them in dense, vaporous mist and rendering it impossible to see things even in close proximity, including each other. Luffy? He heard Ichigo's voice call out over the noise of the gale, sounding somewhat more distant than only a moment before. Over here. Luffy responded, jogging in the direction he'd heard the call come from. But against the wind, it felt as though he was running nowhere. But there were more sounds now. More vague presences humming on the edge of his awareness. They weren't alone. In the spontaneous spot storm, Luffy felt other presences emerge, not unlike the one they'd seen from the ship earlier in the day. He felt his muscles tense and his senses on high alert. Ichigo, he spoke firmly. Nearby, the Shinigami shifted. I know. They were upon them within a matter of seconds. Luffy's fist connected with the jaw of an offending creature, sending it flying into the nearby forest, where it loudly broke through the boughs of a tree. The sound of scrambling, however, indicated it was up and as mad as ever. But it would need to wait its turn before confronting Luffy again. There were a whole lot more. Luffy could feel his blood pumping fast as he fought the near-invisible enemies in the mist. He could hear Ichigo fighting as well some way off, but dedicated his focus to fighting away all the creatures he could. Persistent, aren't you? Luffy grimaced, sending another set to the ground. It seemed as though the majority were now gone. Luffy turned his focus to Ichigo. Are you doing all right, Moon Guy? He asked, using the old nickname. He knew Ichigo was currently unarmed, and therefore relying on hand-to-hand combat as opposed to his usual sword style. "I was about to ask you the same," came the response, not far away at all. However, the encounter wasn't over. The wind grew stronger once more, to such a degree that the almost ear-splitting howling sounded like a wild beast on the rampage. Luffy struggled to take a step forward against the powerful bombardment of air. It hurt. The wind was beginning to channel into a wide funnel, a lot like the one that had deposited part of the crew unevenly across the island. Somewhere amongst it all, he sighted his companion. "Ichigo!" Luffy shouted after him, reaching out his bad arm and snapping it back suddenly, with a painful lurch. This was giving him more trouble than he's bargained for. "Luffy!" The reply came, though increasingly distant. A harsh appendage grabbed at his upper arm, pulling him downwards. Normally, the creature would be simple to get rid of, but given his current predicament, it took a lot more effort than Luffy would have liked. But now the wind's grasp was tearing him away, along with the howling creatures. The funnel had grown extensive, scattering all within its way. "Ichigo!" Luffy called out again, but amongst the howling of the wind and buildup of the fog, Luffy could neither see nor hear him. He reached out again, desperately feeling for his friend. But there was nothing but cold air. Ichigo reached his arm out, empty air being the only substance he met. The mist cleared, revealing the creatures had disappeared somewhere into the night, perhaps having become equally lost by the temperamental weather. "Luffy!" He shouted out into the surrounding darkness, uncaring of who heard him, as long as he could find who he was looking for. But his calls, like the Straw Hat Captain, were lost in the icy wind. Chapter 31. Lesson 2, Stay Alive. Chopper couldn't guess what time it was. Not when it was always night and he had no idea how long they'd been out here. Nevertheless, he padded through the snow alongside Usopp and would occasionally wonder when the sun would rise, before realizing that it wouldn't. Not while they were here, on this island. After a few more minutes, the three of them stopped to rest and recuperate by one of the many chasms. The fight against the Shriekers had lasted what had felt like the better part of an hour. In reality, it may have only been a few minutes, but for Chopper, the onslaught of creepy-looking beings seemed almost infinite. They weren't overly strong, but they were persistent. He was able to send them flying meters in his horn point, but they would be back. Chopper wondered if they felt pain. However, there were more pressing matters at the moment. He was beginning to grow hungry, as were the other two. They'd even worked up a sweat despite the cold conditions. Thankfully, there were no severe injuries among them, and what little bruises and scrapes there were, Chopper was easily able to tend to. At the present moment, he'd reverted back to his brain point from the walk point he'd changed to for easier travel. He was about to change back again, when something in the distance caught the three's attention. "What are those?" Usopp asked, fumbling to his feet and gesturing towards a cluster of forms silhouetted in the dim light. Zoro looked over, his one good eye narrowed as it peered through the darkness, trying to discern the figures that lay ahead of them. From what Chopper could gather, the creatures they'd encountered so far were difficult to detect with sensory haki, though he chose not to comment on it. "Whatever they are, I don't think they're alive," Zoro said after a moment. Usopp raised his goggles over his already sharp marksman eyes and focused. "They look like snowmen?" He soon realized. "Snowmen?" Chopper questioned, moving over to take a closer look. "Who would be making snowmen out here?" Exclamation mark. Zoro asked no one in particular as he cautiously approached, hand at the hilt of one of his katana. "Hey, look at this," Chopper said once he'd reached the closest one. Reaching for the orange scarf firmly tucked around its neck, "Isn't this Brooks?" Quote. Usopp bent closer and inspected it. "It is." "That idiot, isn't he taking this seriously?" Zoro growled, looking out for any sign of the jovial skeleton. Chopper sniffed at the snow, searching for any familiar scent of tea leaves the skeleton always smelled of. But, aside from some lingering traces on the scarf, they had all faded. "He's not here anymore," he informed the other two, "the scent is hours old. He's probably far away by now." "Hey, how do you think he's holding up?" Usopp asked, slightly concerned. "Do you think he's met any of those creatures?" "I don't think he'd like them." "He'll be fine," Zoro assured. "He may be an idiot, but he can be scarier than anything we'll find out here when he tries." Nami steadily made her way up the side of the mountain alongside Sanji. They'd found an old path that had made their ascent easier, although there was nothing that could be done against the cold, nor to ease the strain on her tired legs as they continuously made one step after another up the slope. Not long after reading through the stone carving, they had encountered evidence of more shriekers within close range of them. Nami could see them in the night, close to a particularly large fire chasm. It appeared to be a settlement of some sort, she'd discerned as they'd peered from the trees. These creatures had to live somewhere, after all. It was likely there were several similar sites dotted all around Erebus. She and Sanji had opted to stay away, however. She could only imagine the types of grotesque things they were likely to find within their enemy's dwelling. From what they had seen, however, Nami could gather a range of information. For one thing, there were different types of shriekers. Some were bigger with more muscle mass. Others were more slight and could move faster. For another, there was more than one settlement. There were various areas in which these creatures collected. Perhaps they dominated different territories. Was it possible that some settlements would engage in warfare against others? And what about those other creatures that were different entirely? Nami shook the thoughts away. She was overthinking. Besides, if one thing was certain, it was that these things were their enemy, regardless of their relations with similar creatures. "You're tired," Sanji noted her slackening pace after a few moments. "Well, yeah," Nami retorted, "we've been at this all day. Or night. Whatever we're supposed to call this. We can rest," Sanji offered. "I'm fine," she insisted, "let's continue, and if we don't see anything within the next hour or two, we can get some rest. For now, let's focus on getting back to the others." She knew Sanji would agree with her. Nami-san is so wonderful when she's determined. He flounced. Nami rolled her eyes and continued walking. At least nothing was dampening Sanji's spirits. Hopefully the same could be said about her other nakama. There was no doubt that the others would easily be able to hold up on their own, wherever they were. They'd get all the answers they needed whenever they found someone. The main part of town was behind them now, though they were still in amongst what once must have been the suburban sprawl. Frankie and Robin hurried undetected by their would-be pursuers as they headed for safe ground. Safer ground at least. Frankie doubted there was anywhere actually safe on this island. Even when they were sure they had thrown of their pursuers, the pair continued toward the outer reaches of town. At least they'd gained items of use during their time here. The second journal half tucked into Robin's coat, and the eternal pose in Frankie's own would help them out for the remaining duration of their stay in this place, and afterwards as well. Though of course, even once they'd reclaimed Sunny and the rest of the crew, the ship couldn't go far without a functioning rudder. Frankie would have to see to that. From what I gather, the further up the mountain you go up there, the more dangerous it gets, Robin voiced quietly, well out of earshot of the persistent entities. Frankie frowned. The others wouldn't know that, would they? Quote. Robin shrugged. We currently have no way of knowing what they've experienced so far. It would be unfortunate if any of them have fallen into a fire pit or been ensnared by the monsters. They'll be fine, Frankie assured, they're all strong. If they fall into any immediate trouble, they'll be able to fight those things off no problem. Perhaps, Robin agreed, but we've only encountered the small fries so far. From what I've read, there are a range of other dangerous creatures that lurk this island. Frankie glanced across to her. There are others? Quote. Yes, Robin replied, and what we've seen so far have been the Shriekers. Shriekers? Frankie asked. The journal's author spoke of them. They were the most commonly encountered creature after the accident in the mountain, Robin explained. The author and his comrades were able to capture a few specimens by harnessing some natural, non-lethal sedatives. They range from about 1.8 to 2.5 meters tall, and their appendages are sharply taloned. They make gut-wrenching vocalizations that give them their name. Somewhere in the distance back from where they'd come, one such cry sounded. So I hear, Frankie observed. Even among each of the different groups though, it seems as though there are subdivisions, Robin continued as they picked up their pace. From what the journal describes, these ones are probably the weaklings. Individual power of the Shriekers ranges more than any of the other creatures. Nonetheless, they are easy to overcome in small numbers. But the same can't be said about the others. So, Frankie began. What are these others like? Quote. There are also another group that are fairly common, though I've read that they prefer to linger further up the slopes of Dusumet. Robin continued in a hushed voice as they stuck to the darker shadows of the town. Senses wary. These ones are four-legged with odd faces and bodies. They range in size, from that of a large dog to a large horse. The writer of the journal refers to them as chimeras. I see, Frankie acknowledged. Super interesting, what other things are there? Quote. Specters, Robin replied, we haven't seen any yet, but the others mightn't have been so lucky. The journal describes them as being tall and wispy. Ghost-like. It says they can pass through material objects and are capable of some type of short-range teleportation. They can cover seemingly large distances very quickly. The journal author and his comrades were not able to capture any specimens, but it is estimated that stand from about 2.7 to just over 3 meters. Their limbs are long and have a tendency to drag, and they've been known to feed on Shriekers on regular occasions. Nice. Anything else we should know about? Frankie asked. The journal does mention one other type, Robin said after a few moments, though from what I can tell, it's a lot less common than the other three. It resides deep within the mountain, but that's all the journal has said of them so far. There may be some more information on them. There are still some pages I haven't read. We just need to find someplace safe to stop so you can read them then, Frankie said. There was a shuffling somewhere to their right. And it's not going to be anywhere in this town. If we're looking for safety, we won't find it up the mountain either, Robin said, preparing to fight if need be. From what the journal says, the further up you go, the more fearsome the creatures become. How much further, Nami-san? Sanji questioned from beside her. Nami turned and observed the way they'd come. They'd gained a lot of altitude over the past half hour. Looking up at the mountain, however, she saw that it reached upwards for some time longer. So far, there had been no sign of any of the others. But they had to be out there. Nami was determined. She tried not to let the cold affect her thinking too much. How much further should they climb? And where would they go from there? The summit was probably still far off, and they didn't need to climb that far. "We'll climb a little higher," she said, "and then we'll begin walking around it. If we can circumnavigate the mountain, we'll get a good view down on a lot of the island. We'll probably manage to spot some of the others or the sunny, if the fog isn't too heavy." Right now, it wasn't. Although the same couldn't be said about other parts of the island. Down below them a forest sat swathed in a blanket of gray cloud, and further up the mountain was probably much the same. Nami decided that a little more altitude was all they needed. Once they were high up enough, they could begin rounding the mountain's massive form. From there, any sign of their other nakama would hopefully be easier to find. And hopefully they themselves would not be easier to find for certain other life forms. "This is high enough," she stated after another half-hour of solid climbing. "We'll try circumnavigating from here. See if we can find any of the others." Sanji nodded his agreement. The chill factor in the air was far greater than what it was further down the mountain. Nami's legs were numb, though whether it was from the cold, from walking for so long, or from something else altogether, she was unsure. Perhaps it was a combination. After a while of walking along the mountain, which actually proved more difficult than walking up it, as there was no trail, they discovered an old structure in the distance. "Looks like a house of some sort," Sanji noted. "Who would have lived up here?" Nami wondered. Sanji shrugged. "Could have belonged to a miner." "And where did that miner go?" Sanji didn't answer, probably having not heard her question. It was a question that didn't need answering, however, Nami figured. As they drew closer to the structure, they discovered it was not a house, but an open station of some sort. Running through it, a long cable was extended, ascending high above the slope. A few meters down the hill, the slope and cut off into what must have been a towering ravine. "It's a station for the cable carts," Sanji observed. "Reminds me of the one on Drum Island. Must have been how they got to the top of the mountain." Sure enough, the high-hanging cord that secured the cart stretched far further up the mountain than they had climbed, disappearing into the mist after about 50 meters. In the station's dock, a large steel cage-like cart rested. A commonly used mode of transportation some while ago, Nami mused. A lever rested in a nearby grove, long untouched. Sanji approached and pulled at it. It creaked with a low groan. After a moment, a collection of cogs began turning in the ceiling, and the steel carriage began moving down the mountain and toward the cliff's edge. "An easy way down," Nami observed. "Maybe we'll use it later if we don't head down some other way." "Whatever you like, Nami-san," Sanji affectionately coaxed her. "I'm sure whatever option you choose will be the best." Nami sighed and closed her eyes. It was calm. But something in the air was off. Nami nearly gagged when a putrid smell invaded her senses. Wind was coming down the mountain now, in their direction. Sanji noticed it too. His gaze darted up the mountain. A waft of mist was edging down, closing in once more. It was coming towards them from down the mountain as well, as though hunting them down, cornering them. In the brief moments of their conversation, the mist had crept closer. Quickly. Now, rather than being a whole 50 meters between them and the fog further up the mountain slope, it was a mere 20. "Sanji-kun," Nami muttered. From within the mist, a range of growls and cries could be heard. Dark silhouettes of creatures forgotten by the rest of the world emerged. their twisted and gnarled bodies moving like broken marionettes as they slowly ambled toward their prey. Cursing, Sanji put himself between Nami and the oncoming assortment. Behind them, the horrid vocalizations sounded as well. Nami turned to see a range of deathly pale limbs twisting up from the cliff face, followed by the same sneeringly unhuman bodies in equal perusal. They were climbing up the mountain. It would be easy to run. To jump aboard the cable cart and retreat back down the mountain the way they'd come. Nami could feel a part of herself wanting to do this, but then could she be certain these creatures wouldn't follow them, now that they'd already hunt her and Sanji down? It was likely they'd been following them since shortly after the fiery settlement. Was there any guarantee that they would stop? Nami's hand went to her climb attack, folded away in the holster of her thigh. There was no running away. Not now that they'd come this far. They had to find their nakama. She could tell Sanji felt the same way, though she could also detect his confliction. He didn't want her to have to go through this. Sanji clenched his teeth over one of his last cigarettes, lighting it as they were approached. "They've found us." He was alone. Luffy ran, his feet kicking up the snow behind him, and his stomach feeling as though it were in the process of digesting itself. He'd been separated from his nakama and then separated from Ichigo. He didn't like being on his own, he never had as much fun. He pulled himself up into the branches of a tree, reaching the summit and squinting his eyes against the fog. There was no way he could see anything from up here. He was completely and utterly lost, and there was no way around it but through it. With his good arm holding onto the topmost branch, he descended a few meters at a time, his feet soon meeting the icy forest floor. There was no sign of anyone. He was well and truly alone. His good arm snapped back into place from the low branch above him and he continued on his way, in no deliberate direction. At the back of his mind, he knew this form of navigation was flawed. It was only inviting the possibility of going in circles, although he was already lost. The full light of the moon reflected down through the trees and onto the snow, lighting a path for him in what was otherwise a deep and eternal night. At least the moon was full, that was some luck on his side. Coming here during new moon would be disastrous. He slipped, his good arm reaching to the trunk of a tree to steady himself. Wincing, he straightened up and leant his weight against the tree for a moment. Those creatures had chased after him for a while before he'd made his retaliation. Some of them could climb. Luffy had sat in one of the top branches as they circled the tree, all attempting to follow. Most of them dropped off after only a short while, unable to grasp the simple concept of climbing. Others had been more successful. And they'd been more difficult to defeat. Nonetheless, he'd defeated them all so far. He only hoped there'd be no more to run into before finding his nakama, though if those creatures were what stood in the way of him and his friends, he'd unhesitatingly tear them down, as he'd done before. And as it turned out, it seemed that would be the case. There's more out there. He vaguely sensed the presences on the edge of his field of observation, lingering as though unwilling to confront him unless he drew any closer. Luffy stepped away from the tree, contemplating their next moves. He could make out shapes in the snow. A sound shifted somewhere ahead of him, and another presence lightly touched the edge of his sensory haki, though it was difficult to place. Whatever was out there was good at concealing itself. That, or it wasn't even trying. A creature jittered out at him from the shadows of a tall tree. Luffy had barely allowed the surprise to settle in, before punching it square in the face. But it wasn't the only one. 3 more ambled out at a similar pace, despite any sensory indication that caused Luffy to assume they were further away. He twisted and planted his good arm in the snow, putting his weight on it and twisting, kicking them away as he stretched his leg to spiral outwards. He barely noticed them coming. A four-legged creature came lunging at him and he dodged it, before sending it back into the forest's depths with a swing of his fist. It came back a moment later, however, its angled jaw snapping angrily, its gray skin simmering with rage. "Gomu Gomu no pistol!" Luffy yelled, his fist hitting the beast with all the brute force he could muster. It was not as effective as usual, but sent the creature flying nonetheless. It probably wouldn't be back for a while. However, during his run-in with the large four-legged thing, more of the two-legged creatures returned. Luffy found himself circled by another four of the shrieking entities, each towering him as they went about their otherworldly noises, their white and lifeless eyes almost staring through him. A painful lurch caused Luffy's hand to involuntarily reach for his injured shoulder, causing all the diversion the creatures were waiting for. They were upon him. Luffy winced as a taloned hand grabbed at his shoulder, nearly piercing it with the sharp growths. Kicking his foot into the neck of one of the other shriekers, he pried the offending creature off him with the strength he could muster. However, his enemies were persistent. No matter how many times he punched them away, they'd come for him again, shrieking their rage. Until they realized there was something else out there. It was suddenly cold. Even more so than before. Luffy shivered against the chill and looked on in confusion as the creatures who had only just been giving him a difficult time quickly slunk away. But then their reason for doing so became all too apparent. Something else was out in the mist. Something even the shriekers feared. Luffy brought his field of senses the best he could. On the edge of the mist, he could see it. A tall figure looming in the distance, its long appendages out of proportion to the rest of its body as it slowly crept towards him. Ignoring the pain, Luffy readied himself for combat. The form materialized next to him and Luffy barely had time to duck as it swiped. "Close," he called, allowing the snow to absorb the impact of his fall before bouncing back up. He clenched his fist and swung, only for it to pass through the form entirely. A ghost, he realized in surprise, reeling his arm back in with a snap. The apparition loomed over him, its arm swooping down once again in a slashing motion. Luffy dived out of the way in time to see the ground he'd just been standing on be rained on by the powder of snow the creature had caused to fly up. Again, the creature was at his side and he barely managed to dodge it. A tendril of pale gray wound around Luffy's ankle and he was jerked upwards by an appendage of some sort. It then slammed him into the icy ground and began to drag him. Luffy struggled against it, but any physical attack he tried would simply pass through it, despite the creature easily being able to touch him. There was no way for him to physically combat it. But whilst the sea stone may have restricted his abilities, there was no way of repressing his other means of combat. Take this. Infusing his fist with armament haki, he felt a satisfying impact as he made contact with his enemy. The creature loosened its grip in surprise, allowing Luffy time to fight his way out of its confines and get to his feet. He tried punching again, but the specter was too fast for his growing fatigue. He had little time to dodge its path, before a narrow but long cut found its way along his left leg. He grimaced. It wasn't a bad wound by any means, but it was annoying. A fight against such a creature in his current condition was not good. But the creature wasn't laying off. It materialized beside him once again and prepared to strike. Luffy wouldn't let that happen. Get lost. He unleashed a full wave of his haki, causing the trees around him to splay over and the surrounding mist to clear. The creature paused for a moment before dissolving. Though Luffy was sure it had only retreated and not completely beat. Nonetheless, with the last of his enemies out of the way, Luffy continued to run, keeping an eye out for his nakama. Eventually, he reached a particularly close cluster of trees. A sudden wave of drowsiness hit him, and he stumbled against the icy trunks. There had been barely 10 creatures all up. Luffy found himself in silent gratitude there'd been no more. He nestled into a small alcove of one of the trees. A few minutes. That was all he needed. He just had to replenish his strength and then he would be back out there, searching for his nakama and kicking any ass that happened to get into his way. It was no longer a question of how to slip by the Shriekers undetected, but rather how to fend them off in multitudes now that they'd been discovered spectacularly so. Sanji had long since given up on counting the number they had yet to take down, and he knew it was unlikely Nami was keeping track either. There were just so many. Thunderbolt tempo. Nami cried out for what must have been the 4th time, making use of the storm clouds she had already gathered. A series of lightning swiftly followed, striking a number of Shriekers where they stood, but missing far more often than it made contact. These creatures were no conducts to electricity, so it seemed. Diabol Hambi. Sanji's kick plowed through their group of attackers, managing to take some down, while others remained standing. Their rages in strength differed, so he noticed. They all had the same void expressions, however, their lifeless eyes reflected nothing. Sanji found more pressing issues to tend to than wonder how they'd come into existence. Sanji-kun. Together. Nami alerted him. Sanji nodded and readied his stance. Cool ball. Nami yelled, tearing the climatak down through the air and prompting an array of ice-cold bubbles to form in the chilly atmosphere. At least this weather was good for something. With Diabol Hambi still activated, Sanji jumped through the air and kicked, swiveling. The mini inferno blazing at the end of his leg formed in a donut shape and expanded outwards, colliding with Nami's attack as it drifted into the range of the downhill Shriekers. Together, their attacks combined in midair, causing an explosion that sent many of their pursuers flying off the cliff face. We did it! Nami cheered. Sanji was just contemplating how cute he found her joy, when it occurred to him it was short-lived. Even after such an attack, there were still too many. Far too many. Nami was fighting them again, using her climatak both as a staff for brute physical combat, as well as the weapon it was originally intended to be. Gust Sword. Even with a name like that, the attack was more like a gun. The shot sent one of the creatures flying backwards, barreling into several others as it went. Why he was thinking such a thought at the moment, Sanji couldn't guess. Gritting his teeth over his second-last cigarette, he slammed his hands into the ground, prompting them to support the rest of his body as he descended into a roundhouse kick. Various cries graced his ears as the creatures around him were sent through the air, some off the edge of the ravine. He'd just placed his feet back on the ground when he heard a scream. Looking over, he found Nami to be struggling against the consistent bombardment of Shriekers, one having successfully grabbed at her arms from behind. Hot rage entered his veins as he rushed forth. "Get your hands off her, you shitty bastard!" The fire from his leg connected with the creature's head and subsequently caused to lose its grip on Nami, and she gratefully beat it away with her staff. "Thank you," she gasped. "No, Nami-san. Are you hurt?" he asked in concern. She shook her head. Seems they don't like fire, hey? Quote. Sanji glanced at the remaining shriekers around them. He could take down several at once with a single kick. But still there were more, a supply that seemed to endlessly replenish itself. How were there so many? Where did they keep coming from? They must have passed right near a thriving population of them. But how? They'd done their best to avoid being seen. Somewhere to their left, a glint in the moonlight caught Sanji's eye. Nami-san. Look out. He dove in front of her, blocking the path of the fine but sharp projectile as it came flying through the air. It caught him above the left hip, piercing through his clothing and pricking into his skin. Sanji-kun. Nami screamed as he hit the ground. From the corner of his eye, Sanji spotted a crouching shrieker leaping towards his prone form. But in a flash of movement, Nami was in between them, deflecting the predator with a strong gust of wind. Another moment later and she was at his side. Sanji-kun? Sanji smiled weakly, shifting himself into a sitting position. You saved me, Nami-san. Idiot, you just saved me twice. She snapped in retaliation, whacking away a smaller shrieker as it came too close. Sanji got to his feet, the dart dropping to the ground as he did so. It had obviously been a tranquilizer of some sort, intended to slow down whoever was pierced by it. It must have been made with toxins in the local wildlife. But it would take more than that to bring him down. Sanji-kun. Nami nudged his arm, indicating to the cliff. Oddly bent limbs appeared from over the edge, followed by a series of bodies as the shriekers from the explosion rejoined the battle. Are you kidding? Sanji thought, mild despair settling in as even more emerged. Didn't we take care of you lot already? He asked dejectedly. Nami brandished the climatact, but Sanji was formulating another plan. Leave them to me, he instructed. Nami ducked as he leapt over her, his leg ablaze as he launched himself into attack. But no matter how many times they took down their opponents, new ones would come in and replace them. Another dart struck him in the leg before he could dodge, and he tensed at the sudden burst of pain. It was nothing. He'd endured far worse. There was a cry as Nami was slashed in the side by another attacker. Nami-san. He rushed over to her. With the climatact still clutched firmly in her right hand, her left instinctively shot to her right side, pressing down in the injury in attempt to still the pain. I'm all right, she insisted. The wound was only shallow. Her coat had taken the brunt of it, a narrow slash running diagonally across her right side. The injury was far from major, but was enough to make Sanji's blood boil. Immediately, he leapt to action. Diable Hambi. His leg moved too fast to be tracked by any normal eye, thwarting enemy after enemy in his wake. But some of the shriekers were stronger and more adept than others. By skill or lucky chance, unlucky, on Sanji's part, a strong and sharply taloned hand wrapped itself around his ankle, and pulled with a painful jarring before slamming him down into the snow-covered ground. Sanji-kun. Nami's voice came from somewhere nearby. He couldn't let himself be defeated. Not now, while she was still here and in immediate danger. Sanji let his leg ablaze with Diable Hambi, causing his captor to shriek in agony and let go. Quickly, he got to his feet. He tried not to limp, attempting to ignore the obvious sprain in his ankle. Looking around, he cursed. There were now more of them than ever. How could he have become so careless, especially when he had Nami to protect? Despite his best attempts, he found himself staggering slightly. While the 2 tranquilizers may not have been as effective on him as they may have been on a normal person, they certainly had effects. It was because he'd been struck by them his defenses had been down and Nami had been hurt. Yet if he hadn't have been struck, Nami would have. And now, he couldn't even harness his skywalking abilities, they'd been blocked. His refusal to remove himself and Nami from the situation earlier had resulted in this. I'm such an idiot. He should have skywalked himself and Nami out of here earlier. But whatever he'd been shot with, while not disabling him completely, was slowing down his movements and made him considerably weaker. It was enough for him to continue fighting, but skywalk was now completely out of the question. Nami winced, the wound in her side obviously bothering her. No. He couldn't let her get hurt any longer. He wouldn't allow it. It may have been impossible now for the 2 of them, but he could still remove her from all this. Nami, he said above the noise, get in the cable cart. Are you sure? Nami responded, disabling the nearest shrieker with her staff. What about the others? Quote, I think our chances are better off elsewhere right now, Nami-san, Sanji said, blasting another 2 over the edge of the cliff with a single kick. You never know. They could be just down the mountain. Nami hesitated for a moment before she nodded. Okay, she turned and hurried for the cart. Sanji followed close behind, if only to keep the creatures away. As soon as he knew she was inside, he kicked the door shut, jamming it, and pulled the lever before she could realize what he was doing. Sanji-kun. What are you doing? Her voice came from within the contraption. I'm getting you to safety, he answered, before turning back to face the numerous shriekers. The things down there were nothing compared to this lot. None would follow her, he'd see to that himself. Sanji-kun! Exclamation mark. Quote. If I go with you, they'll follow us, he explained. Get away from here, Nami-san. Find the others. Get back to the ship. I won't let a single one of these shitheads gets past. The cart was going faster, disappearing over the cliff's ledge. Sanji. She cried out for him, but her voice was nothing but a fading vapor in the oncoming storm. Sanji lit his final cigarette and glared up at the multitude of shriekers now surrounding him, their blank eyes shining maliciously. He exhaled a cloud of smoke and prepared his stance and rested the majority of his weight on his good leg. The creatures around him chattered and went about their awful noises, as though taunting him, challenging him. But here he was, ready and willing. As long as their focus was on him and not his dear Nakama. Give me all you've got, he prompted. Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See you next time, faves.